So welcome to the second day, the rainy second day of the Heterodox Academy Conference. My name is Evan Goldstein. I'm an editor at the Chronicle of Higher Education. Our topic today for this panel is which ideas gain entry into the academy, who decides, and how. I hope to largely stay out of the way and let the panelists do most of the talking, but I do want to start with a story, and fittingly it comes from John Haidt, who's in the front row, so he can tell me if I'm butchering it. So Haidt told me this several years ago when heterodox was in its infancy. And it dates from when I think he was a professor at the University of Virginia, and it was routine for the psychology department to hold these talks in which scholars would come in and present their research and progress. And at one of these, the topic was women in math. And the presentation focused on the cultural signals and messages that young girls receive that dissuade them from pursuing math and science. And at some point, Haidt hazarded an alternative possible explanation, the influence of prenatal hormones. Haidt asked, is it possible that girls are just less interested in math? To which the room responded with dead silence. At some point, Haidt pressed on. Wait, does anyone think hormones might influence behavior? Again, complete silence. All right, good. All right, I got it. And as Haidt later told me, nobody agreed, nobody disagreed, nobody would touch it. That's when I realized our science is suffering. Social science is really hard. It's always multiple causal threads. If several threads are banned, then you cannot solve a problem. And I thought of that story when Heterodox asked me to moderate this panel, because to me it helps to underscore that when it comes to the theme of this panel, the stakes are quite high. At stake is how higher ed functions as a marketplace of ideas, how knowledge advances or fails to advance, how disciplines police themselves. At stake is who gets to be heard on campuses. At stake is whether the academy is capable of hosting vigorous debates on sensitive questions. And I hope we can get to some of that over the course of the next 70-odd minutes. With the panel, of course, but also with all of you. We spoke earlier, and we all want to set aside considerable time for your questions. So please be thinking of those as we're doing our thing, and I promise to cut us off to leave that time. And also with Alice Drager's apt question from yesterday on my mind, to the extent that there is disagreement either on the panel or in the room, I hope we can surface it over the course of this. So the panelists should feel free to interject at any time, quibble, expand on the point made by someone else, etc. So let me actually introduce the panel. Next to me here is Coleman Hughes, who studies philosophy at Columbia University. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Quillette. You might know he's had an unusually busy week. On Wednesday, he was testifying before Congress on reparations, and last night he received an award from Heterodox, so congrats to you on that. Next to Coleman is Dan Mogulof, who's the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Executive Communications at UC Berkeley's Office of Communications and Public Affairs. Next to Dan is Judith Shapiro, an anthropologist by training and longtime president of Barnard College, who then went on to serve as president of the Teagle Foundation. And next to Judith is Keith Whittington, the William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Politics at Princeton University. He writes about politics, American constitutional law, American political thought, and perhaps most relevant to this room, he's the author most recently of Speak Freely, Why Universities Must Defend Free Speech. And Keith also received an award from Heterodox last night. So congratulations to you, Keith, as well. So each panelist is going to kick things off with a short opening statement, opening thought. Keith, do you want to start and we'll come this way?
Sure, why not? So one of the things I've been struck by in thinking about this sort of campus free speech space is the potential distinction between academic freedom on the one hand and campus free speech on the other side. These are often blurred, I think, the way we publicly have these conversations about free speech, all put in the same box of free speech. And one of the pushbacks I've gotten about the book is the extent to which it wants to talk both about academic freedom issues and free speech issues under this sort of broad rubric of free speech. But I think there's important sort of theoretical tensions there and also practical tensions there between free speech and academic freedom, whereas academic freedom particularly focused on the ability to engage in open inquiry primarily by faculty, but to some degree by students, both in the classroom and in our research. More generally, there are interesting connections between that and sort of ability of professors to be able to speak publicly about matters of public concern, which AUP wants to lump in as part of academic freedom. And I've tried to unpack a little bit as to where I think that's complicated to think about that as part of academic freedom. But one striking thing about that sort of orientation around academic freedom is it's precisely a freedom that's constrained, as we noted last night in some of the panels as well, by disciplinary expectations about what counts as good quality research, what's quality teaching, what's consistent with expectations within the discipline. Whereas free speech, on the other hand, we really regard as being grounded much more in sort of a democratic egalitarianism, where everybody has their opinion, they're capable of expressing it, and we welcome that. We expect there to be some space on campus to engage in that kind of free speech, but there's obviously some tension between the academic side, where we think that we're guided toward the truth by pursuing certain kinds of disciplinary constraints on how we go about doing that, what kinds of knowledge has been validated, what kinds of knowledge is not being validated. And on the other hand, this sort of Wild West of free speech that we also sometimes welcome on campus. And there's certainly, I think, those who want to say that the free speech part of campus needs to be constrained by the same kind of disciplinary constraints that are imposed on the academic side of campus as well. So Robert Post has suggested some of these things. Stanley Fish is pushing in these directions. And there's a real complication as to how you would try to extend the logic of academic freedom and the kind of disciplinary boundaries that imposes to thinking about free speech in general on campus in ways I think would wind up restricting quite a lot of the kind of debate we're familiar with on college campuses. But I think that's a persistent tension on college campuses and will continue to be a tension going forward.
Yeah, please, Judith.
Well, I should first note that in between being invited to this panel and today, as I was having dinner in a Chinese restaurant with friends, I got the following fortune cookie, which I thought really, we'll forget the men. Men are apt to settle a question rightly when it is discussed freely. So I thought that really was very good. And then also, I thought I would begin also quoting Christopher Lasch on what he calls the lost art of argument. We have to enter imaginatively into our opponent's arguments, if only for the purpose of refuting them, and we may end up being persuaded by those we sought to persuade. Argument is risky and unpredictable, and therefore educational. He goes on to say, we will defend democracy not as the most efficient, but as the most educational form of government, one that extends the circle of debate as widely as possible. I want to underline the word educational and then really take up what's already been said about the issue of academic freedom and freedom of speech. And that is that there is something in between disciplinary standards and the Wild West, as you talk about it. And that was discussed by Deb in opening and also by Lynn Pasquarella. And that is, what are the core values of higher education and above and beyond disciplines that seem to have to do with a search for truth, that have to do with caring about evidence, that have to do with logic, and that have to do with reason generally. Now, I think I don't have a solution for this, but it seems quite reasonable for institutions of higher education to care about those standards and to see, again, we'll quote another, this time it's Mark Twain. The trouble with the world is not that people know too little, but that they know so many things that ain't so. So we live in a world where there has been this has always been the case. I mean, Mark Twain wasn't born yesterday. But how this has been amplified by the information technology world within which we live. And therefore, I have a concern that this focus on invited speakers, that has taken on these massive dimensions, and that we focus on it all the time, and we do have to think about it, and who should invite them, and what are different kinds of speech events. I'll get back to the speech events in a moment. Is that our students really need from us the tools of sourcing, the tools of evaluating and dealing with different media. They also need to learn the interpersonal skills of speaking, hearing, reading, all of those things that go with speech. And then I would just finally say that, but before I forget, on this issue of this median academic freedom that isn't just about disciplines, there's a group called Scholars at Risk that is the major sort of international promoting academic freedom organization that finds positions for individual endangered scholars in this country, but also monitors the state of academic freedom that is freedom in line with the core values of education worldwide. But the other thing is that we also need to differentiate among different speech events. And that is, commencement is one kind of speech event, your class is another, and there are various things in between. And the idea of having a bunch of people, including students, a group then sitting together and deciding on a commencement speaker, may want to consider what kind of speech event that is, to whom it should be directed. Might students think of what their parents might want to have as an experience at commencement, where the goal for most families is, there's a wonderful Yiddish word, naches, which means most basically delight and joy and pride in the accomplishment of a loved one. That's kind of what they want to see happening. So that may not be the best place to have someone who's going to make everyone angry and start a riot. So I think that's probably enough for now.
Right. So I'm looking forward to talking with the panelists and with you about the fact that for UC Berkeley, the Wild West was not a metaphor. It was our reality during 2017 and 18, particularly around the issue of guests who came to campus. And in fact, for us as a public institution, the very question at the heart of this panel has no meaning. The question, who decides? Well, the Supreme Court has decided for a public institution. It's made clear what it feels about prior restraint, and pretty much that means we've been at the mercy of our student groups who have legal autonomy on campus in terms of who they wanted to invite. But we've learned some important lessons along the way, and one of them is that if you're going to embrace the very idea of heterogeneous perspective, diversity of perspective, you also have to take into account the diversity of your population. As our Chancellor Carol Christ has been saying quite often in the last couple of years, free speech isn't a thing, it's a process, meaning that many of the truths that we may all hold to be self-evident ain't necessarily so with people in our community. And how you see diversity of perspective and how you see particular opinions and receive them really depends on who you are. Our world started to change in December 2017 when I began to receive letters, vigilante letters, saying, if you let somebody named Milo Yiannopoulos, and I had no idea who he was at the time, if you let him come onto the campus, we will be forced to take matters into our own hands. And so we came out and we made some very clear public statements that, based on the First Amendment, that he had every right to come, and as abhorrent to some of his views were, he would be coming to campus. And it turned out that my name was posted to an anarchist website. And lucky me. And I started to get all kinds of phone calls. And I'll share a couple of stories. One came from a member of faculty screaming at me, how can you defend this man's right to come to campus? And I said, I'm sorry, Professor, he's covered by the First Amendment. No, she screamed at me, he is not. And I said, interesting, why do you think? She said, because he's wrong. Tenured member of faculty. Next day I get a call. Girls in tears, one of our students. Mr. Mogulof, she says, how can you allow this man to come? I am a transgender, undocumented student. I'm going to go to his session, and what he's going to say is going to destroy me. And my first thought was, maybe you shouldn't go. But I missed something as a white male. Let's remember, while the First Amendment is pretty clearly understood, there are many laws that do say that speech can be harmful. Think about laws around sexual harassment. The very idea that we were allowing somebody to come onto our campus who would engage in assaultive rhetoric, the sort of which would get a student bounced certainly out of the high school she came from, she couldn't understand it. And who am I to judge that? Who are we to know what that lived experience has been like for her? And so we've been going through this process for the last couple of years about figuring out how we engage our community, how we bring them down that road. with the understanding that, boy, where you stand depends upon where you sit and who you are and how you were raised. Finally, last thing, we talk a lot about diversity of perspective, but we don't talk about diversity of objective. I really wish the Constitution paid some attention to the diverse motives of speakers. Milo Yiannopoulos came to our campus not to engage. He came to provoke, he came to create fodder for his social media channels, and to increase his income. No doubt about it. Ben Shapiro came to our campus to engage. We were the happy hunting ground for him. He engaged, and he did something beautiful in his speak when he talked to students. At the end, he said, "Who disagrees with me?" Bunch of handshots. Goes, "I want you all first in line." And there wasn't a single problem. No riots, no fuss, no muss. But we're not allowed to discern, so that's another issue that hopefully we can talk about, is the diversity of objective among some of the speakers who are coming to our campuses.
Thank you. Is this on? At the risk of offending the audience, it seems to me that most of you are not current college students. To think of yourself as lifetime learners. I guess I want to address my comments mainly to the students, and I want to suggest that we should act as if no one is coming to save us on this issue. There is a heterodox academy, there's FIRE, there's a few other organizations doing this work, but we are the ones on campus, and almost by definition, we are the ones that have the ability to influence this problem in a more direct way. So I'm on the board of a club called Colloquia at Columbia, and I've never been a joiner in my life. I've always taken some perhaps irrational pride in not joining clubs. I don't know what that says about me, but I guess that's for me and my therapist to sort out. But this is a club that I wholeheartedly love. Every Friday, we get together in a room, we take one topic. Sometimes it's controversial and political. We'll do gun control or abortion or whatever. And sometimes it's just a topic like love or religion. I suppose religion is somewhat controversial as well. But we split the room into two, and you have to argue one side of the proposition, and then halfway through, we switch, and you argue the other. And then at the end, we just talk about what we learned from being forced to argue both sides of the case. And it is absolutely my favorite thing to do. I love being forced to argue something that I disagree with, and really getting in character fully to feel what it would feel like to believe this. So what we found, wow, is that too much? Is that good?
Yeah, hold it down a little bit.
So what we found in doing this exercise is it started out like 5 or 10 people, and now the room is overflowing every Friday. The demand for this has absolutely skyrocketed. Many people who didn't know that they wanted this on campus didn't know that they weren't really getting it in many of their classes, unfortunately. Not all. So you do get it in some classes, but it's, those classes are few and far between, and too contingent on the quality of the specific professor, which varies extremely widely. So what I want to suggest is that the adults, although we're kind of all adults at this point, have a role to play, of course, but there's something of a handicap with adults, which is to say, if you were an adult and you happen to be either conservative or a centrist, the truth is we have a kind of anti-authority culture in America, which is something I actually love about this country and is not true of many places in the world where you simply cannot question adults, period. So, but the downside to that is there's only so much you can do when a student is yelling at you with all of the moral righteousness that attends that sort of experience, and you feel that you've lost the room. Everyone in the room, you can just feel it, right? And I'll note that this actually doesn't happen the other way around. If there's a very left-wing professor that's being challenged by a conservative student, or not even necessarily by a conservative student, somehow the authority does in that moment do its job. But because of that handicap, I want to suggest to students that we should act as if no one is coming to save us, and we should note that there is a lot we can do by forming organizations on campus, and we don't have to wait for this problem to be solved from the top down.
So I want to try to suss out what's particularly salient about the theme of this panel now in 2019, because of course intellectual communities and academic fields have always enforced a kind of orthodoxy. As Keith points out in his book, Carrie Nation, the prohibition provocateur, touched off a near riot in Berkeley in 1903. And some of you might know the incident where E.O. Wilson had a pitcher of water dumped on his head at the American Anthropological Association in the mid-70s, maybe 1976, for suggesting that human behavior might have biological underpinnings. So in some ways, it's always been thus. But my question to each panel is, I'm just trying to get sort of a read of the temperature here. Do you feel that the spectrum of ideas entering the academy has become more constrained? And is therefore academic discourse actually more impoverished now than at some previous time? I guess the easiest way would be to start back with Keith, who's had a good rest over there.
I don't know if it's more constrained, right? I mean, I think there are always topics that were difficult and hard to explore, either because there are internal pressures inside of academia not to talk about them, or there are external pressures not to talk about them. But it changes over time as to what those topics are. And so I think we now have a set of issues that are hard to discuss in classes and even in research that are probably different than the set of issues that were similarly difficult 20 years ago or 50 years ago. But I don't think there was a golden age in which everything worked fine in academia, that there were no threats to free speech and academic freedom. I think some of the details of the challenges have changed a little bit. But I think we're confronting a perpetual problem in academia itself, but also just in liberal societies more generally. That it's hard to dissent, hard to think for yourself, hard to maintain spaces where people will tolerate discussions of difficult issues. And we've got those challenges today, but I think people had those challenges before as well.
I think we can think about what have been contributions of faculty members to unfortunate situations in discourse in the academy. I mean, we might consider, for example, the relationship of the prestige of deconstruction into mindless relativism. Then I think we also see this fear of offending students that is a bit of a problem, and I would say even more than a bit of a problem. And then there's the faculty missing in action when there's somehow an upheaval going on around speech. And I'm talking about faculty in a less fragile, like contingent faculty, but tenured faculty who sit back while students confront administrators. And I think that's another issue of speech in the academy and what's going on.
I would return here to the same theme. I'm very wary of painting with a broad brush. And I'm constantly thinking about different parts of the community. I think in some parts of our student and our faculty and our staff community, there is more willingness than ever to engage in issues, and there are people, as a sort of response to all that happened at Berkeley, have even more interest in finding and creating platforms for civic engagement in a civil manner. But at the same time, thinking about the offense issue and Bret Stephens' piece about how many in the younger generation, offense is a way of gaining power. That's certainly something that we see on campus. And in the context of everything being politicized right now and the tribalism that we see in our student community, there's sectors of our community where engagement is all but impossible. And I haven't heard anybody come up with the secret sauce about how to address that. And there's a fissure in the campus community, among those who want to engage and those we know enough. You're horrible, you're great, whatever. The world's painted only in shades of black and white.
So the question is, has it gotten worse, right?
Yeah, to the extent.
I'm not in a great position to answer that because I graduated high school in 2014.
Yeah.
But one thing I'll say I do worry about is for someone in my position, 2014 is more or less when the most recent wave of this really sparked. That's kind of a mixed metaphor. But what I do worry about is for kids that have only ever experienced this kind of climate, you would have no reason to think that it could be different. And therefore, you might have no reason to feel the impetus towards change. So that's one thing I do worry about. If this becomes, if a culture of self-censorship becomes a norm, and it's not problematized, and it's not. This is one way in which older generations are have a huge advantage and are extremely critical, which is you have the ability to remind young people what is possible, what was more true 20 years ago than it is now, and what kind of values we are blind to just by dint of the moment in which we were born.
If I could just add to what Coleman said, that is kind of an argument. I think you are quite right in saying what students need to do, what students can do and need to do, but what you've just said is really a word on behalf of grown-ups. And that is to justify the fact that there are those of us that are actually getting paid and others that are paying, so there should be something of value that we're contributing. And by the same token, when faculty members do not behave like grown-ups, but behave like trolls online, and instead of observing how can we actually be teaching when we say these things? How is it different from what we might say over adult beverages in our living room, not online? I think that's a really major problem these days, is how a lot of faculty members behave online, which is not professional and not remotely grown-up.
So let's try to get to the who decides aspect of this. As Dan points out, that question is out of the hands of his institution and other public institutions in many ways. But at least in terms of the privates and so forth, it's fairly easy to say that ideas without any intellectual grounding can be ignored. But who gets to make that determination, and based on what characteristics? Do you have any thoughts, Keith, on how to handle these situations? Solve the problem for us, Keith, please.
So I think it's a challenge, and I think it's partially a genuine theoretical challenge, because I think in part academia has to be committed to the idea that it needs to be a porous system in which it's possible for people with dissenting views, heterodox views, to enter into the academy, be successful in the academy, be able to mount research and teaching questions that are outside the mainstream, not only of American society more generally, but even of their own disciplines. That we're not going to be able to progress if we shut out those kinds of internal criticisms and dissenting voices from the get-go. At the same time, we're trying to enforce some real disciplinary constraints about how you go about engaging in those processes. And moreover, locally, we may well find that it sometimes makes sense to specialize. So I can easily imagine, for example, a single department making decisions that we can't represent everybody in all kinds of views, even in our own discipline. We're going to have to make some choices. Some things are going to be excluded in order to focus our attention on some issues we think are particularly important, or in order to build a critical mass where we think we're going to get real synergies by speaking in that way. But there's a danger that if every institution is making those kind of individualized choices, that globally we wind up shutting out some voices that need to be able to make some space within academia more generally. And how you go about the institutional process of managing that so that globally we're quite open, even if locally we can be somewhat closed, I think is a real difficulty.
I think we can also distinguish among different speech situations or speech events, so that a faculty member inviting a speaker to her or his classroom, is at one end, and then maybe commencement is at the other. And in terms of the public versus private, I mean, I really don't think that it's that difficult for, let's say, a faculty together with students to make a distinction between people like Charles Murray or E.O. Wilson on the one hand, and Milo Yiannopoulos or Ann Coulter on the other. Or I'm trying to think of some, it's harder, I'm sorry, help me out here, thinking of some comparably left-wing person with nothing to say of value. So, in other words, I think these are things that private institutions, which is where I've spent, my own working life, are in a somewhat different situation.
Yeah, I would, and even though we may not have the ability to tell a student group no, it doesn't mean that the administration can abdicate its responsibility to both encourage and support all student groups, but also to pay attention to who's actually coming to campus. We did an analysis of speakers who came to campus invited by faculty and departments. And shock of shocks, it skewed about 80-20 towards liberal left-wing speakers. And so the central administration got involved. We started a counterpoint talk speech series in order, and also to model for the students what it might look like. We invited people from opposing points of view. In other words, we didn't just throw our hands up in the air and say, look, anybody who can come, and the faculty invite who they'll invite. But we've also started to take more responsibility for a balance and for a match of word and deed when it comes to diversity and perspective as a key part of the educational mission.
So the question is, who gets to decide? I think the colloquium model is we essentially poll the group. What do you guys want to talk about this week? So it's a very natural process. And again, you don't have to wait to get the superstar professor that's going to assign both sides of every issue. There are professors like that, but you don't have to wait, and it's very frustrating to wait if you're a student. It's very frustrating to gamble on a professor you don't know that could end up changing your life or making your life hell for the next 3 months. And you also don't have to wait. I think Dan said this before, right? It's not all about the speakers. The speakers are important, but in terms of the total time taken up learning and speaking and reading and writing, speakers coming to campus is a very small fraction of that. What matters more is the conversations you're having with your peers. So again, I would harp on my theme. Act as if no one is coming to save you as students. Do it yourself. And the crucial thing to remember when you do that is that it is very, very, very easy to lapse into a war-like mindset. And that is the number one mistake that you can't make as a student group. It is not about battling with the clubs on campus that you feel are dogmatic with your own dogmas, and expect that urge to come. It's human. It's what we're built for. But what you have to do is prize principles above your own natural urge to be combative and tribal. That's what this is about.
So I want to raise the role that money might play in this conversation in various ways. In a very self-evident way, wealthy donors can endow centers and chaired professorships and speaker series and so forth that tend to reflect back their own ideological predilections. A second way that at least occurs to me is that the material conditions of the faculty, as precarious employment becomes more of the norm, as tenure becomes more unusual, how does that change the incentive structure around taking intellectual risks, I wonder? The fear of being branded controversial and the career implications of having that happen, essentially. So I wonder, and there's surely other ways in which money finds its way into this conversation. Judith,
another way in which money finds itself into the conversation is if you think of the cost of dealing with what might happen at one of these speech events.
Yes.
that could otherwise, funds that could otherwise be going to financial aid, you would actually lose sleep.
I've
So-
lost that sleep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when we think about money, we think about the $4 million we spent to provide security for speaking events in 2017, a single academic year. And at some point we started to think that in fact what was happening with certain speakers was akin to what's called a denial of service attack on a website. That they could bankrupt us, understanding what the First Amendment and understanding the legal parameters within which we operate. They would continue to come and Ann Coulter cost us $800,000 and then she decided not to show up. And we also think about money in terms of the money to be made. I mean, Milo Yiannopoulos correctly understood that Berkeley had become like New York. If I can make it there, I can make it anywhere. It's a great media platform. We're a major media market, and we were being monetized as a university. And we rose to the occasion. I mean, we really wish the students would have ignored him, but they didn't, gave him exactly what he wanted. So money plays very differently, for us in that regard. Free speech ain't cheap.
Yeah. Yeah.
So one thing I know about money is that I think from a conservative perspective, there is an instinct now, I think many on the right, to be thinking about how should you defund universities? How do you reduce the amount of funds going into universities because the resources are supporting activities and speech that you find inhospitable and disconcerting. And I think one thing we want to be encouraging those on the right to be thinking about is instead channeling more money into universities and channeling them precisely in ways of trying to diversify speech. So rather than trying to shut down departments and programs and speaker series and legal clinics that you don't like, instead find creative ways of funneling money into programs and departments and centers and speaker series that you find more attractive. So that ultimately what we all be trying to build is a pluralistic system in which a multitude of voices are being heard on college campuses. A variety of different research programs and teaching programs are being pursued on campuses. And so rather than being concerned about how do we shrink that pot, how do we expand that pot and try to diversify that pot in various ways? Because I worry that we're now in a dynamic in which those who are unhappy with what's going on college campuses have decided that the way of dealing with that then is to simply starve college campuses. And I think we're all going to be worse off if that's the dynamic that takes hold.
I don't believe that. So, I mean, in terms of the point I raised about, is the decline of tenure, is the feeling of precariousness among so many faculty members, do you believe that is having effect in making the academy less disputatious and therefore less rigorous when it comes to the ideas that are up for debate?
Certainly the case that contingent faculty are the most vulnerable to being fired, for
Yep.
example, right? And so when you look at instances in which people become the source of public controversy and administration start looking at them, is sometimes the case that tenured faculty find themselves in real difficulties on that front as well, and some administrations behave very badly relative to tenured faculty as well. But it's obvious that the untenured faculty are the ones who are very easily tossed out, sometimes very quietly. In terms of contingent faculty, it's simply a case of not renewing their contract for the next semester. And so the extent to which that's a large fraction of the people in academia, it means that both teaching and research are going to be highly constrained by people who have to look over their shoulder and worry about what the consequences of what they might say might be.
Yeah. Judith, I assume you have a great deal of experience in fundraising. I know the Barnard Endowment did quite well under your stewardship. So I wonder, being involved with those conversations, how often do donors want more control over the kinds of ideas that flow from the money they are contributing?
That is not how the funds came in that I fundraised
Yeah.
for. And it really is a bit of a problem because you do not want donors dictating what
Right.
you're going to do. And the things that, and so they weren't curricularly focused one way or the other. What you really try to do, there are building improvements, you do financial aid, which is as good as scholarships, are as good as unrestricted giving. So that really did not arise as an issue, and I think that's the only problem with that, is you do not want funders to dictate how their funds are going to be used.
Yeah.
Although I understand the desirability of.
I think the question is what the details look like of that, right? I mean, I think that it's possible, and funders certainly do come in and say there are certain kinds of things we want to encourage, right? I want to help fund a neuroscience program as opposed to some other kind of program, right? And so within some broad rubric, we want and encourage that. But when I think about, for example, the North Carolina legislature deciding they want to shut down legal clinics in the University of North Carolina Law School because some of those clinics are engaged in civil rights litigation that the North Carolina legislature is unhappy with, then that some of that I think is going to be hard to push back on because those legislators are going to be unhappy with that litigation regardless. But some there is a question of, well, how can we find ways of funding legal clinics that do things other than civil rights litigation? Because the legal clinic environment is extraordinarily lopsided in law schools. And from a conservative point of view, you'd be very concerned about that. But there are things you could be doing on the other side that would say, okay, well, let's create some new legal clinics that are concerned with things that conservatives also care about. So the overall environment of legal clinics is more diversified. And I think from a conservative perspective, then people will be somewhat happier with the
But
results.
I think the way that's resolved then is you don't have somebody coming up to you saying, at least in my experience, or you shouldn't, saying, I want to fund neuroscience.
Yeah.
What you do is you have a strategic plan and you decide as an institution what you want and need to fund, and then if you go out and find a donor, I mean, you decide first, okay, what do we need here at this institution? Then you can go forth and say that so-and-so is likely to be a good funding source for that particular thing.
Yeah. I should just say, Evan, it was surprising to us that the extent to which we heard, after the riot that shut down the first Yiannopoulos appearance, we were surprised by the response we got from donors and alumni. Which gave lie a little bit to sort of the stereotypical view about who goes to Berkeley or who graduated from Berkeley. They were furious at what they saw as an abandonment of the university's ideals and its basic values. That regardless of the fact that 150 ninja warriors from the Antifa movement had showed up outnumbering our police, they did not want to see that happen again. And every letter said, we cannot stand Milo Yiannopoulos, but this is not the Berkeley we know and love. And you guys need to do a better job with that. So they can also be a source of support. They can help stiffen the spine and help sort of expand and diversify that community that you need to rely on to support some of these speakers who are going to be very divisive. So it was an interesting reaction. And so too, as we sort of began to address and have more conservative speakers come to campus, understand better how to function in this environment, the degree of support that we heard was pretty astounding. And I'm talking about letters in the hundreds that came in over the course of a couple of weeks.
So I want to switch topics a little bit to because What Conversation in 2019 can't include a segment on social media. I want to ask about the role of that and hopefully get Coleman in on this because I'm sure he has the most Twitter followers of anyone up here. And so, I see this playing out in at least two ways, the role of social media. I mean, obviously, there's the rapidity with which a controversy can take hold and then generate kind of petitions with hundreds and thousands of signatures in a way that prior to social media would have been unthinkable, and probably previous controversies sort of petered out for lack of interest, but there's a quick building storm that kind of happens. Alternatively, I often wonder, someone watching the plight of a Rebecca Tuvel or any number of other people who get caught in the eyes of these storms, what lessons do they take from that, even subconsciously, about, again, intellectual risk-taking and so forth? Furthermore, if the sort of validation feedback loop that people get on social media encourages the pursuit of certain questions and certain lenses on certain topics and so forth, again, how does that factor in? So that's very broad, but I just wonder if you guys have thoughts on, and we can start with Coleman on this one, to what extent you think social media is shaping which ideas get entered into academic discussion?
You couldn't have possibly asked a question more relevant to my life right at this moment.
I'm glad we got to a
I'm really glad that I'm at this conference all day because I won't be checking my Twitter all day. But suffice it to say, I am currently in the process of being absolutely canceled all day on Twitter, and you only need to look at it for a second to get a sample. But I think the lesson that we have still failed to learn is that Twitter is not real life. Something like 20%, I think, of the American public is on Twitter, and that overstates the degree to which it's representative of the public, because only something like 10% of Twitter users are responsible for 90+% of the content. So you're talking about 2% of the American population, and it's not a random sample. It is a highly, highly non-random sample. I think our politicians are getting confused by this, probably. As you can see with the popularity of Joe Biden, despite if you kind of look on Twitter, it seems like, wow, this guy's just getting trashed constantly. Everyone must hate him. And then you poll the American public and he's like way out ahead. I think that we almost need we need to coin a new term for like the cognitive bias of assuming that what's happening on Twitter is anything like what's happening in the population at large, because we're all designed to like make this mistake, and we keep making it. So we need some kind of we need to just kind of cement this as a mistake that we're all making, and have the vocabulary to talk about it, so that we can stop making it.
I mean, I would say I could repeat a lot of truisms about the social media world, about how fast it moves. And in the early days of the internet, they used to say on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. And now on social media, nobody knows if you're a liar. Everything has sort of been leveled up to the same level. And that's just a part of our life. We operate on it constantly. And if I talked before about that idea of the First Amendment and diversity of perspective as a process, not just a thing, and the need that generates to communicate with our community and understand that it's a very diverse and different community, we have to meet them where they are. So we have to be active players in that space constantly. We have to monitor it constantly. The power of pictures and images, the live streaming, and it leaves no time for reflection. So it puts a premium on advanced planning, scenario-based planning for an administration, because when the excrement hits the ventilator, it's too late, and you've got to be ready to roll. And we learned that the hard way. And I think that is a truism, but it's one thing to think about it theoretically. We lived it for a couple of years. We've increased our staff. We've increased our engagement across all of the platforms, monitor it constantly, and have a rapid response team ready to go. Because, boy, once that thing takes hold, walking it back, all but impossible. That thing being the lie, the false narrative.
I can't remember who it was. Someone here will remember in the pre-internet era who said that a lie will make its way around the world before truth has a chance to put its socks on. Yeah. And now, I mean, that has been amplified in conspiracy theories and things, and not just Twitter, but I mean the whole enchilada of media.
So Dan, let me follow up on something you said, which social media is a useful kind of early warning system that excrement is heading towards the ventilator on your campus. Is there also the reverse risk, though, of administrators overreacting and making the mistake that Coleman's saying and confusing Twitter with real life?
Absolutely. I mean, I often feel that our administration can be led around by very small groups of students who are expert at taking offense. Mm-hmm. And seem to all know the Chancellor's personal email address. But at the same time, they understand that we have a weakness as administrators, that we have a Vice Chancellor for Equity and Inclusion. It's part of our institutional value. And they know how to get our attention. That tail can wag the dog constantly. We have a silent majority in our university, and I would imagine the same is true for many of you. But still, Evan, you ignore them at your own risk, because they're the ones who are going to be camped out in front of the Chancellor's house in a hunger strike. Mm-hmm. They're the ones who are going to turn to the media. And they're a part of the community. And so it's a delicate balance. And you just need to constantly question yourself and find ways of understanding what the student body thinks. I would love to have the resources to do polling every 2-3 days. What do you know? Where did you hear it from? What do you believe? Are we doing the right thing? We do it instead of just randomly like, oh, the chancellor got 3 emails and is that. It's a huge problem that we actually don't know what the majority of our students think or how they're receiving these things. Berkeley is seen in a very stereotypical way. I've been there 15 years. I've never been to a protest where there were more than 1,000 students out of 30,000. And so I remember being asked by a reporter once at one of those demonstrations, what's the administration thinking about today? And I said, we're thinking about the other 29,000, right? But could we ignore those 1,000? No, even though that was a tiny percentage of our student body. It's just a fact of life on a big public university.
So as promised, let's open it up to see what you all have to say. I assume there's microphones that will soon make their way around the room. So how about you right here up front? Yeah, I think I caught them off guard on that question.
Hi. You mentioned the high cost of free speech, and I was wondering how much the security threat around controversial speakers comes from the fact that colleges have previously treated disruptors with kid gloves and have not really taken any decisive action. So I'm asking if you think the high cost of free speech might be because colleges have previously not come in favor of free speech as decisively.
So I happen to believe there isn't a single answer to that question. I mean, we had something unprecedented happen at Berkeley. I was in the middle of it. As Milo Yiannopoulos was about to begin speaking, literally 150 members of a paramilitary group showed up on our campus wearing ninja outfits, dressed from head to toe in black, carrying Molotov cocktails, swords, baseball bats. Let me tell you something. They weren't there because they thought we were easy in the past. They came to rumble. They came highly trained, strategic to shut down that event. They shut it down and they left. I don't believe a single one of them thought, oh, Berkeley's kind of soft in the past. Let's hit them hard. It was the perfect stage to make the point they wanted to make. Might there be others for whom that's the case? Yeah, I'm sure that's true. But part of it, and we saw this in one of the other shocking things after the whole Milo Yiannopoulos thing, the daily, our student newspaper, the Daily Californian, was filled with op-eds from students and faculty condoning the violence that basically said, damn right we shut that guy down. Administration couldn't do the right thing. There was no talk about, yeah, we can shut it down because we know that we'll get away with it. People are fired up and angry and ready to really put their own safety and well-being on the lines. So I think while there may be some truth to that, if we accept only that, then we blind ourselves to a lot of what's going on right now. People are angry.
Right over here.
Hi, my name is Bill Warner. I teach at UC Santa Barbara, and I've taught a course on free speech for the last 25 years. And what's striking to me, and something that's very difficult to kind of deal with, is cultural change. Because you can have cultural changes around free speech, and it inflects and changes free speech. So, in the 60s, those of us who came of age in the 60s and 70s were used to the ethos that it's good to shock people. It's good to come up with the unexpected, to startle people into some new kind of knowledge. And this is true in the arts. It was true in politics. It was true in sexual liberation movement. But when you come into the present, immediately you have questions and issues that barely existed in the 60s, like harm. Maybe this speech is going to harm certain people in the audience, and we have to inflect our speech to take account of that. And the whole logic of acting up and being bold and startling and shocking has been devalued or challenged or can get you in trouble with certain people. So what do we do about that kind of culture, that global cultural change in relationship to the culture of free speech?
Yeah.
I would just say that I think that's a very important point. And the question is, how can we think about generally in our pedagogy, in our campus life, how we can best play to students' strengths at a time when there's so much pressure to play to their weaknesses. And I don't have an easy answer for that, but I think you're absolutely right that this fragility thing, and I don't have to tell this to Jonathan Haidt, or actually anyone here perhaps, it really is an issue now.
Way in the back, next to
Have any of you invited a conservative to campus during your time in as a professor or as an administrator? And I'm not talking about the silly people's like, what's this guy, Yeo or something. I'm talking about strong conservative speakers. Have any of you ever invited anyone?
So I should say Princeton, I'm fortunate my colleague Robert George started a center, James Madison Center, quite a few years ago now, which routinely brings in conservative speakers. And part of what's striking about his effort on campus is he's not bringing in the Milos of the world. He's bringing in serious conservative thinkers, sometimes scholars, sometimes public intellectuals, and the like. And so he's routinely, as a consequence, exposing the campus and exposing the students to what serious conservative voices look like and sound like. And I think that has a real positive effect on the intellectual environment and campus and the ability of students to learn how to tolerate a range of views.
And I think also going beyond inviting speakers, I was teaching at one point in between my retirements and getting in which I taught Burke and Rousseau. Now, students who think of themselves as conservatives could probably not recognize Edmund Burke in a two-person lineup. And so I think that, I mean, the particular course that I taught was based on playing highly complex games, historical games, and the nice thing about that is it got them being highly active in taking on these different positions that we were hearing about in colloquia. So I think, again, there's something about this focus on outside speakers that is distracting us from all the other stuff we need to be doing.
I agree, but
Yeah.
I think.
But I understand your question, yeah.
Have you hired any conservative professors?
I don't hire them all by myself, but I haven't
I
hired...
know that, but have you pushed to hire conservative professors?
I do not recall hiring any professor in context of their political views. And we were hiring in many different fields. So no.
So I think your question speaks to something else, and that's the role of the media. We've invited dozens of conservative speakers at Berkeley, and I would hazard to guess that many people aren't aware of it. After everything blew up with Milo, the Berkeley College Republicans brought, 8, 9, 10 top shelf conservative speakers. No demonstrations, no disruption, no coverage. Wasn't interesting. No conflict. Nobody mentioned it. Nobody knows about it. They were kind of disappointed by that. Tough luck. We sort of think one of the reasons that, and they only invited one speaker, Berkeley College Republicans, in the last academic year. The best they could do was Sean Spicer, right? We kind of took the fun out of it by continuing to say, yeah, bring whoever you want. But so part of that is there's that echo chamber of it's not real unless it's been covered. But these things are happening on our campuses every day. The fact that the media don't really care if there isn't any conflict creates doubt in people's minds about actually what we're doing, and that's a whole sort of raises a whole separate set of challenges. How do you make sure people understand who you are and the extent to which your words and deeds are matched up? And as long as you need to rely on the kindness of journalistic strangers, that's going to be that's a heavy lift right now. Over here.
Hi, I have a question building off on Judith, your response earlier about playing to students' strengths more than weaknesses. I was wondering, because so much of free speech initiatives on campus are focused on the speaker, bringing outside speakers, the message, the wording, how do I frame this, and in order to to have free speech prevail and everyone be okay with it. I was wondering if the colleges could do a better job at parallel processing that sort of training with the receiving end of things, and some sort of training on campus for a sort of cognitive behavioral therapy of self-agency. I'm going to make a wild assumption that most college freshmen are capable of agency, and knowing that I don't have to be offended. It's my perception. It's sort of an empowering thing to realize, and I don't see that happening on campus. Maybe it's a media thing, maybe that's boring coverage, but I would love to know your thoughts on that, if colleges can do a better job, and how, and...
Well, I think yesterday's panel included some very good examples of things that are in fact going on at colleges in just that way. And I saw the people from yesterday here. I think that, I mentioned reacting to the past, which is this way of teaching with historical games that I think really plays to students' strengths, but it's getting a lot of pressure by students who, you know, what if I play a white plantation racist owner in a racist plantation owner in the South around before the Civil War, and those are things to really think about. And how do you do something like that? But I think also the program you mentioned, Colloquia, is a very good example of getting students used to adopting positions, arguing for them, and to spread that out. It's nice that the room is big. Maybe it can spread to lots and lots of other rooms. But I think that's a very good example, for example, of strengthening students.
The other thing I would say is that probably most of the battle, much of the battle, at least on the viewpoint diversity front, is not the viewpoints themselves, but the psychology and the psychological and mental health of people. And that is something that is probably not talked about enough in this space. We can read John Stuart Mill all day, but if you're a person who has a closed mindset, well, let me put it this way. If you're a person who, when overwhelmed by an emotion, hasn't developed the cognitive skills to step back, observe your emotion as if from afar, and realize that this is transient, this is that you need not be a slave to your emotion, then you know, I can shove on liberty down your throat 1,000 times, and you might even agree with it intellectually, but in the moment, you will be part of the problem. On the other hand, you can get someone like Cornel West, who, by many people's estimations, has kind of extreme politics in the sense of being a Marxist, but is absolutely the most charitable human being you could possibly think to talk to, because it's clear, even when he's fired up about something, that there's a healthy layer of separation from one's own emotions. So how we get there is a conversation that is very important and needs to be had, but that's more than half the battle, I think.
But on that conversation, what's interesting is many students do come to college in various states of psychological distress or on medications, and so we've had this hypertrophy of counseling centers and counseling services. So the question then becomes, what pedagogically might we be able to do, because we are in the higher education business, what might we be able to do through pedagogy to achieve some of the ends that people are getting sent to the counseling center for? I don't have the answer to that, but I would like to think that there are some.
Over here.
Hi, Andrew Del Banco from the Teagle Foundation in Columbia. One quick observation and one quick question. It's a very lively panel and very valuable. I would observe that the institutions represented, Columbia, Berkeley, Barnard, and Princeton, are hardly representative of the larger landscape of American higher education. And that's not I mean, you know, you have to make choices in putting together panels, so that's fine. But my observation, based on my years in the classroom, is that the kind of free speech controversy and the very sobering remarks that have been made about Berkeley are conspicuously absent from most of the institutions represented on this panel, with the exception of Berkeley. There are complicated reasons for that. My sense is that the the free speech issue on those campuses is more likely to be of a subtler variety in the classroom, manifested by the impulse by faculty to censor themselves, or on the part of students in the classroom who may be reluctant to speak up for fear of being disapproved of by peers. So that's just an observation and a suggestion for a different conversation. The question is, how pertinent do you think any of these issues are for the vast majority of undergraduates and contingent faculty who are working in open access public institutions, which we hear almost nothing about?
Yeah, I think that, for example, the vast majority of students in community colleges, which include many non-traditional age students, are certainly sufficiently busy with the demands of their lives not to feel unsafe when they're in school. So I think it's true that we wish to keep track of which aspects or which segments of the higher education population we're talking about at any given point, indeed.
It's also worth noting, I think, that as you suggest, that the challenges are very different in these different kind of institutions, right? We focus a lot of attention on these high-profile controversies about outside speakers, mostly at elite institutions, often elite institutions, very particular types. And that is one kind of free speech and academic freedom issue that rises on college campuses. But for the vast majority of college campuses, the issues are much more low profile. They're much less below the surface. They often are questions of resources, where there are institutions that can't afford to bring in speakers at all, and so they are in a complete dearth of outside speakers that might liven that environment. They have to rely on contingent faculty because they partially don't have the resources to be able to do more than that. There are broad swaths of higher education. They just aren't teaching the subject matter that ought to be taught because they are trying to restrict their focus to a handful of things given resource constraints and other constraints. So I think that focusing our attention on outside speakers is important. It's part of what we ought to be worried about with higher education. But there are a lot of other challenges in higher education, a lot of them below the surface, and a lot of them are at those institutions. I began my career at a much less well-resourced institution, the Princeton University, and I'm extraordinarily grateful that I'm now at Princeton precisely because I have access to resources and have an intellectual and administrative environment that's supportive of the work I do in ways that wasn't true at the start of my career. And so I am particularly concerned that those institutions are able to do a better job in the future and can overcome some of the struggles that they're dealing with.
I'll just say really briefly, I continue to believe the majority of our students really are not engaged in these issues and don't care. The students that do punch above their weight because of their access to the media and the influence they have on the reputational interests of the campus, the obvious influence at Berkeley and impact they had on our alumni and our donors, and their ability to attract attention and resources. And so numbers aren't always the most important determinant in terms of how we think about these issues.
Right over here.
Coleman, I love what you're doing, and I have an invitation for you later. I want to ask a question about, we had a visitor to our campus who talked to us about strategic communication, University of Missouri. And he talked about the manner in which external parties were taking information that was accurate in terms of something going on within the institution and fusing that with information that was inaccurate in a way that created a narrative. Apparently they learned this when they analyzed things after the fact at University of Missouri. And what that did when they posted this information on social media, it really distorted the truth, it ignited crisis, and it confused students. And if you know anything about that at University of Berkeley, and if you do, how are you addressing that? Whether quietly or
I'm crying myself to sleep every night. I mean, I feel a little bit, you know, I feel a little bit, to sort of paraphrase Casablanca, liars in the media. I'm shocked. No, it's been a huge problem. I mean, an anecdote, Ann Coulter was going to come to campus, and at the last minute she bailed out. She actually tweeted, "I've been disinvited. I'm decided not to come." I will not name the outlet at the moment, but one of the outlets that's more about affirmation, not information, on the right wing of the political spectrum, you can probably figure out who it is. They put out a report that we had banned her from campus. Our phones lit up within 30 seconds. That nonsense that was in contradiction to Coulter herself caught fire on social media, and we spent the next 2 days trying to put out that fire. So you just have to be persistent. You have to make sure that word and deed match up. With the way we changed the narrative was with $4 million. The Chancellor said, these events are going to happen. And even when when Ben Shapiro came, the Berkeley College Republicans had invited him, they forgot to say charitably to book a venue. There wasn't a venue available on the day they committed to. The Chancellor said, I'm paying for the venue. Because if I don't, they will say that we canceled Ben Shapiro. Sure enough, he came, the whole narrative started to change. You have to be one step ahead. We're blessed by having fantastic leadership. Our Chancellor understood it was a chess game from the very beginning. I was in her office multiple times every single day with our police chief, with our Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs, trying to stay constantly a step ahead of the game. Despite that, and I think we did a pretty damn good job, we probably lost as much as we won in terms of the media battles. But here too, don't paint with a broad brush. Not all outlets that call themselves media outlets are journalistic outlets. There are very few where there are still fact-checking, where there's still some effort to have balanced, accurate information. And so you have to care about the persuadable middle and think about where that persuadable middle gets its information from and write off the rest. It's hard. I fail at it every single day, but I'm told, again, Chancellor will sit me down to just worry about the things that we can actually influence. The rest of them, they don't care what the truth is. And it's a sad fact about where we are. We're not going to change it, I don't think, anytime soon. So expend your efforts where they may actually have some payoff.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. In the back corner of this middle section. There you go.
Hi, Brett Weinstein. In the last couple of years, I've been invited to a lot of discussions about free speech on campus. I appreciate that this panel was actually not, at least in its title, framed around the issue of free speech. But nonetheless, I have the sense that we keep getting this wrong because speech gives us a framework that's very familiar and therefore comforting. And I wanted to suggest a different interpretation, which is that what we are watching are movements in which people are actually exploring a niche. They're learning to get their needs met. And that what we are missing is that they are able to do that because the university is not serving its purpose. It's therefore vulnerable because nobody is that interested in defending it. And so my question is, how can we reflect on the job that we are doing and the racket that the university has become in light of the debt crisis, and recognize the role that is playing in making it vulnerable to the accusations, which are largely false, that are being hurled at it?
I guess the only thing I can say is I don't have the answer, but my experience as someone who from a young age was pretty hungry for argument and very intellectually curious. My experience of coming to coming to Columbia was of, in many ways, disappointment punctuated by occasional delight at specific professors. But the 2 or 3 professors I've had that have been just excellent, and it's been such a joy to be a part of their class, and they've signaled that you can say whatever you want here, and have just been masterful in the way they've managed the classroom, have been the exception to the rule in my experience. And I am certainly so like when I go to colloquia, I have the distinct experience of getting something that I need that I'm not getting from the classroom. And the amount, the level of demand for that group suggests to me that there are so many students on campus that are hungry just to debate. And it doesn't even matter if they're debating on the left or the right. They want just open debate. And I tend to agree with you that that demand is not being met where it ought to be met, and is therefore popping up in sometimes unhealthy ways. I don't know how to fix that.
Judith, you can have the last
I just
word.
don't know if I agree with the premise of the question, since it seems like such a wild generalization. Given my age, I am more than willing and will often actually say that things used to be much, much better. On the other hand, I think, just to generalize in that way about the current state of life in the academy, given that I still hang out there quite a bit, is I find a little problematic.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to the panelists.